Hi, this is Professor Kahan Lust. Welcome again to History 1301, United States History 2, 1877. Today we are on lecture 12, American Reform. As I mentioned in the last lecture on the Second Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening leads directly to this reform movement. A lot of the people who are involved in that religious awakening are going to start pushing for all sorts of different types of reform in the United States. Now, when we talk about reform in this country, there's a long history of it, and it has convinced a lot of people that there is a sort of cyclical nature to reform, that there is a moment of idealism where people are sitting around and saying, we've got a problem. Wouldn't it be great if we could solve that? It would be terrific if we could come up with some sort of a solution for it. And then they start thinking in terms of, I think I've got this plan. This could work. They start going out and becoming activists. They start coming up with ways to implement those solutions. And then there's an innovation phase where people are trying all sorts of different things and utilizing different ideas. But then there's another part to it. In virtually all of these reform cycles, if you will, something happens that causes the reformers to become cynical, to become convinced that their work has been a failure, that the reform is actually not worth it, that the world has suffered as a consequence. It's almost always a war that causes this sort of sentiment to happen, and these people retreat from their activism and the like, and the problems build up again, and then another group comes along and takes up the idealism. Now, the reason we say cyclical, or the reason some have said cyclical, is because if we look at the dates for the spikes in reform, as you can see on the screen here, they seem to be accompanied with generational change. So it's not really so much a cycle, which implies that it's happening irrespective of whether humans interact with all of this or not. It's actually generational change. It's a change from one group of people to a new group of people. It's the same thing that we see when we look at parents of Gen Xers having different ideas than their children do, but having the same basic problems. The same basic problems exist. The question is, how do you solve those same basic problems? So we've seen this over and over again in American history. It's no different for this group of people. Now, when we think of our country and in terms of our reform, we see it happening through three distinct phases. The first period of reform is what we are going to call a moral reform effort. Now, a lot of times when we talk about moral reform and this effort to try to make people more godly, we talk about it from the standpoint of it being socially uplifting. And what we mean by uplifting is that you take those who are downtrodden and you lift them up. You fix what's wrong with them and you bring them up. Okay, so social reform, or this moral reform, aims to fix all of these moral problems. It aims to make the United States a more godly nation. Now, among the things that these moral reformers are going to try to do is they're going to engage in things like Sabbatarianism. They're going to have this concerted effort that they want, that they're going to make the United States enforce a Christian Sabbath. Now, we do, on some level, quote unquote, in this country, celebrate a Sabbath. But when these people were talking about it, they weren't talking about, hey, Sunday's the day you go to church, or if you're Jewish, you go to church on Friday, you go to temple on Friday night, or whatever your religious sentiment is, you go when you go. What these people were talking about was, we are so committed to this idea of a, quote, Sabbath, that we want all businesses to be shut down. We don't want any commercial activity to take place. We don't want financial transactions to take place. We don't want the mail to be delivered. The mail used to be delivered 7 days a week. But these people are saying, we do not want that. We want everything shut down on Sunday so that everybody can go to church. Now, they demand that the government do this, but the government is actually not terribly successful at shutting this down. They do shut down Sunday mail delivery, but a lot of industrialists in this country during this era are saying if we shut down one day, that's a lot of profits lost, and we're not interested in it. So, what most Sabbatarians did, instead of being successful in getting states to pass laws against this stuff, they wound up basically going out and buying businesses themselves and privately, as private entrepreneurs, shutting their businesses down on Sundays as a reflection of their Sabbatarianism. Now, I don't want to give you the wrong impression that this stuff is not successful. By the time the 1870s roll around, it's not successful in this era. So in 1301, in a 1301 context, it's not successful. But if you take History 1302, one of the things you're going to hear about is this effort to create these so-called blue laws in the United States. And those blue laws shut down virtually every type of industry on Sundays. So while these people in this era are not successful, their descendants are going to be successful in shutting down a lot of that activity related to the Sabbath day. To demonstrate their commitment to moral uplift, there were also groups like the Gideons that were convinced of, or that saw it as their mission to place a Bible in every home and make sure every person had access to this sort of stuff, so that they didn't have to rely on an institution to get their religious understandings. Now, where these people also turned their efforts were toward prostitution reform. Prostitution reform was a huge hot button issue in the 1820s, 1830s, and 1840s when this reform really starts to flourish in this country. And a big part of why it flourished during this era is in this moment, or I should say even in this moment, a lot of people recognized that the Victorian era had a lot of double standards about what was acceptable behavior for men, what was acceptable behavior for women. These people believed that the male psyche operated in a completely different way than the female psyche did. For example, Victorian era, if we would call them psychologists, they didn't really exist at that point. But if they were talking about the male psyche and the female psyche, for example, they would say that men are driven by reason, they are driven by logic, they are not driven by baser passions or anything like that. That they are not driven by any sort of animal instinct, if you will. They're all based. They're basically about reason and logic. Where women are less refined in that regard. Women do not have the capability to be thinking in terms of reason and logic. They are ruled by passions as opposed to reason and logic. So even in the area of prostitution, people in the Victorian era could look at this and say, even when men go to see prostitutes, which they did in a ridiculous number during this period, they could look at it and say, well, it's not even these men's fault. These women are the worst of the worst, and they are ruled by their baser passions, so they're tempting these men into doing it. Now, add to that, understand this sounds ridiculously hypocritical. There's also another sentiment to this that argues that that men don't have a choice. This is how men are. This is how men cope with certain things. They're able to put on a facade of moralism by going out and engaging in these sort of activities, and this activity is only right from that standpoint. But there were plenty of people who looked at that and said, that's utterly absurd, and we've got to do something to get rid of prostitution in the United States. So reform groups wound up coming to the forefront, and they are going to attack prostitution vigorously. They are going to do things like go out to houses of prostitution. Prostitution is done totally differently during this era. It's done in private homes. It's controlled by women. So they'll go to these private homes and they'll make note. These reformers will make note of the men who are going in and coming out. And then they'll do things like publish their names in the newspapers the next day. They will do things like hold pray-ins. They'll sit outside of these houses and they'll pray for these people, verbally, loudly pray for these people. And the most radical of them started going into the houses and going into the rooms where people were engaged in these sorts of activities and praying around them in an effort to stop them, to physically stop them from engaging in the acts of prostitution. There were other reformers, though, who looked at this and said there's probably an issue of economic deprivation causing women to turn to prostitution. So a number of radicals also did things like create job training programs and what were called social hygiene classes as a way of saying, look, this is social hygiene is about how you keep house and how to keep your house neat and clutter free, essentially, would be the words we would use today. But they're starting those types of clubs as a way to transition these women from prostitution into a sort of family home life. Now, prostitution is considered to be a big business during this era. There were, according to the police chief of New York City, at one point in the 1850s, there were at least 50,000 women actively engaged in prostitution. And he also asserted that at one time in their life, 10% of women in New York City had been involved in prostitution in one form or another. And to what extent they were involved, as in they're still involved or they were formerly involved, is another question. But he said, at least 10% of women had engaged at one time or another in their life. But again, these reformers are not terribly successful. They don't rid the world of prostitution. Do they have some success? Yes. Do they shame people? Yes. Do they transition some women from prostitution to Victorian home life? Yes. But they do not end prostitution. So we can't look at that area of moral reform and say, well, clearly it was a success. But where we can see unequivocal success for these moral reformers is in the area of alcohol consumption, or temperance, as it was called during this era. Now, temperance is a misnamed movement here. Temperance advocates total abstinence. Temperance movements advocated total abstinence from alcohol, but temperance actually means moderation. So these people were not calling for moderation when it came to alcohol consumption. They were calling for complete abstinence. Now, again, what's the problem? As these people saw it, they've got the moral high ground because alcohol consumption is behind every big social problem in this country. And the language is very similar to if we talked about drug abuse today or cigarette consumption today. They looked at it and said, alcohol use is behind industrial accidents, it's behind urban poverty, it's behind child abuse, it's behind spousal abuse. Everybody would benefit, these people argued, by eliminating alcohol consumption. But these people are not yet what we would call prohibitionists. And the reason I say that is because these temperance advocates were just that, advocates. They favored voluntary abstinence. They said, we want you to sign pledges, and they literally have pledge cards that say, I, the undersigned, agree to abstain from the consumption of all alcoholic beverages for whatever period. So they're turning to voluntary pledges. And surprisingly enough, I suppose in some people's minds, it works. In 1800, Americans drank an average of 7 gallons of alcohol per person per year. But by 1820, it was down to 3 gallons per person per year. So something happens in those intervening 20 years to convince Americans to literally cut their consumption in half. And it's this abstinence movement. People looked at it and said, if I sign my name to a pledge, my word is my bond, and they kept their word. But these people are going to transform from advocates into what we would call prohibitionists. Now, prohibitionists favor the same thing. They want total abstinence. But rather than voluntary abstinence, prohibitionists want laws passed, hence the term prohibitionists. They want laws passed that prohibit the ability to consume alcohol, whether it is a law that flat out says it is illegal to consume alcohol, or as many state and local areas took it, it's illegal to manufacture or transport alcohol. That way, it made it tough for people to get, and virtually impossible. Now, what turns this into an issue, what turns these people from advocates, voluntary abstinence advocates, to prohibitionists, is the sheer massive number of immigrants to the United States beginning in the 1830s. Now, in our next lecture, we're going to address that in greater numbers. But understand that something that happens when these immigrants come to the United States in the 1830s, 1840s, and 1850s is they haven't gone through the same temperance movement. So when they're out in Ireland or in Germany or in northern Italy or wherever they're coming from at these various points, they are drinking alcohol at a level they've always been drinking. And then when they move to the United States, they continue that same alcohol consumption. Now, let's assume for a second that people in Ireland and Germany were drinking the same 7 gallons per person per year that Americans were drinking in 1800. Between 1800 and 1820, Americans have the temperance movement and their consumption declines. Europeans do not have that temperance movement. So their alcohol consumption remains consistent. And when they get to the United States, they maintain that same level of consumption. So the argument that temperance advocates were pushing was that immigrants, quote, drink more than Americans, which was technically true. But they drink more than Americans because they get here, they've got no skills, they are impoverished, so they turn to alcohol. So their argument really was they drink more than Americans because they get here, they have no choices, and so they increase their alcohol consumption, which is actually inaccurate. But it leads these people to say our only option here is to favor prohibition laws. And in 1851 in Massachusetts, we get the first prohibition law in the United States, a law that bans the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol. Now, again, the ideas behind this attack on alcohol consumption are very similar to our ideas in the modern era in terms of the war on drugs. Substance abuse is the cause of virtually every problem in this country. If we just wipe out the drug problem, we'd clean up all of these issues of poverty and spousal abuse and child abuse and urban decay and whatever. There's also a very strong class and ethnic component to it. It's about telling the lower classes that if you just adopt our standards of morality, our standards about consumption of this stuff, you wouldn't have the problems that you have now. So there's a specific class and ethnic component to all of this stuff in this era, just like there is in the modern era. So moral reform is the first phase. And again, it's not terribly successful. Our second stage of reform is social reform. And what's happening with social reform is reformers are not looking to uplift society necessarily. What they're doing is they're saying we're going to identify the worst social problems in this country, and we're going to come up with an institution to fix all of these problems, an institution that fixes the problem. Now, an emerging problem as the United States became more and more industrialized was a crime problem, and Americans became convinced we've got a problem with crime, so we have to figure out how do we eliminate crime. Now, it's not as simple as many of you might think. It's not, well, we've got to build more jails and throw more people in jail. That's certainly not the issue in the modern era, so it's not likely to be an issue here. But understand that in the colonial era, the era directly preceding this, the colonial era and early national periods, the United States is very much a nation of small towns. Most people do not live in big cities like New York or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh or Charleston or Baltimore or, pick a city. Most people live in small towns. So the solution to crime and punishment was essentially public opinion. When the public gets together and shames people for what they're doing, that's going to be good enough to stop them. So if you've got a person who's constantly stealing from somebody, instead of throwing them in jail, you put them in stocks in the public square, and you ridicule them as a way of making sure that they don't do this stuff again. If you don't like having rotten produce thrown at you, if you don't like having people walk by you and spit at you and all this stuff, the solution is simple: don't commit the crime. So there's no move to put people in jail. Jails did exist, but not on the same scale. To go out and start arresting people and throwing them in jail would have been a disaster during this era. If people were really serious, if something really, really bad had happened, like if a murder happened, again, we don't throw people in jail in this particular era. Execution is the norm. And for repeat offenders, when it came to theft, it was going to be pretty clear that that person was not going to be able to be trusted in that society. They're not going to live in that society anymore. So what people in that society would do is they'd take these people's ear, and right at the top where there's a lot of cartilage, they'd cut it. They'd cut a notch into that ear as a way of demonstrating that this person is a repeat offender. This person is not to be trusted. So while they're not going to live in that community anymore, they are going to wind up moving out. They're signaling to the people in the next community, hey, this is somebody you want to be aware of. This is somebody who needs to be watched, cannot be trusted. So public opinion is sort of the order of the day. But the United States, we start seeing population growth, we start seeing industrial growth, we start seeing these cities grow, and over time, these public squares and public shaming do not work to deal with the bulk of the population. So a group called the Quakers in Pennsylvania come up with an innovation, and their innovation is the penitentiary. Now, the penitentiary in this era, as created in this era, I know there's a number of different levels of jail today, penitentiary being one of them. Penitentiary here is a very specifically chosen word, and it's specifically chosen to represent the ideal of what's happening with the creation of the institution. First, there's a quarantine of sorts. The idea of the penitentiary is that you're taking criminals off of the street and you're putting them into this building, the penitentiary, so that you can quarantine them so that that crime is no longer affecting the broader society. But once they get into that penitentiary, here's where we start to see the mission. The mission of the penitentiary is to get these criminals to see the errors of their ways, to make them understand they have made bad choices, but if they repent, if they start coming up with ways to look inward and come up with better choices, they'll be rehabilitated. And this is why I say penitentiary is chosen specifically. If you look at the word penitentiary, the root word is penitent, someone who is in the process of repenting for what they have actually done. So, the idea here is you get these people into these jails and they will be able to repent through a series of intense segregation from society, through a period of intense introspection. They're all basically going to be issued Bibles, and they're going to be expected to read them and understand them. They're going to be punished for longer periods of time than they would have been in those public squares, because the idea is you need to have time to sit and, you've all heard the phrase, think about what you've done. That's what they're doing here. They're going to be sitting in their cell thinking about what they've done. And the other thing that happens here, this is a very strange circumstance given how we view this stuff today, but initially everybody is kind of in solitary confinement in these penitentiaries. The thought being, it's awfully hard to engage in introspection when somebody's constantly talking to you. So if you have a cellmate, there's the possibility for constant conversation and thus no introspection. So the thought was people will benefit from being quarantined and isolated within that quarantine. Now, the reality here is that the Quakers looked at this and concluded this doesn't work. They wound up putting these people into effectively solitary confinement and found out that these people lost all ability to socialize. In many cases, they were coming out of these penitentiaries and they weren't reformed, and they were in fact a little bit crazy because they'd had no real human interaction. So the Quakers looked at this, at the penitentiary system, and said, on the whole, this has been a bad decision. It didn't work, so out it goes, back to the drawing board. However, the individual states in the early days of this, New Jersey and Pennsylvania, they look at this and say, we don't care about the rehabilitative effect. What we see is that crime is going down because the criminals have been quarantined in this building. So rehabilitation is irrelevant to us. What we like is that criminals are off the street and not affecting society. So instead of just doing away with the whole thing, the whole system, the states actually take over the operation of the penitentiaries. Now, we've seen kind of a swing back in the modern era where we see the creation of private for-profit prisons. There's the pendulum has not swung back to a sort of rehabilitative mindset, but more to a mindset of the private industry can do a better job of doing this than the state actually does. So they're now back in private hands, just like they were when the Quakers were running them, with the lack again of a rehabilitative emphasis. Now, that's not to say that no penitentiary today has a rehabilitative effort, but the emphasis is not always right at the forefront. Rehabilitation is not always the big thing. Quarantining the crime is almost always the biggest issue. But a lot of people in the aftermath of the Quaker experiment looked at this and said, well, rehabilitation or not, it's worked. Crime rates are down, so the penitentiary works, so it's here to stay. Now, it may seem odd on some level for some of you to see me shift from the penitentiary to the public school system, but the success of the penitentiary in some ways led directly to the adoption of a public school system in the United States. Now, it's a slow adoption process. I don't want to give you the wrong idea so that you're thinking that people in the United States go, oh, we need public schools, and then the government comes along and says, yes, you do. Here it is. It's not how it works. It's a slow, evolving process. We did not have public schools in this country at the start of this nation's history. Most people learned informally. Now, some people did go to schools. Some people went to what were called a sort of primary school that was called a dime school. Some people got their basic education through their church. Sunday schools looked at the children that were coming in and said a key to Christianity is being able to read their Bible. So as long as we have them here, we're going to teach them the basics of reading, writing, and arithmetic. A lot of people got the training, got their education through job training via apprenticeships. So apprentices are not only learned their trade, but again, they learned how to read, they learned how to write, they learned basic arithmetic, so that when they're out on their own as a master craftsman, they're going to be able to actually balance their books. People learned at home. They learned over the course of professional training, like preparation for law school and the like. But we do not have a system of public schools. And yet, strangely enough, in our first 50 years of history, the United States has the highest literacy rates in the world and the single best educated populace in the world. But then in 1831, there's a transformative moment again. In 1831, Massachusetts and Connecticut disestablished the Congregationalist Church, which had always been the, quote, established church. And when the Congregationalist Church gets disestablished, remember that means no money, no taxpayer funds, no state monies are going toward the Congregationalist Church for construction, for payment of salaries, nothing. That means the educational efforts theoretically could vanish. And while a lot of people in Massachusetts were not okay with taxpayer funds covering the church, they looked at those things that the church did and said, we would still like to find a way to have those functions that the church covers. We'd like to have those covered using public funds. So, the state of Massachusetts is going to develop the first public school system to take over those activities from the Congregationalist Church. And some of these activities, right off the bat, if we look at what's happening, these activities are non-academic in nature. Now, don't anyone think that I'm advocating for some sort of anti-patriotism, or don't go rushing out and going, my professor hates America, because that's not what's going on here. But the emphasis here in these public schools initially is non-academic. They focus on things like citizenship, teaching American children what it means to be a citizen in the United States, what the responsibilities of citizenship are, and the like. Teaching them basic behavior, like what's good moral behavior, like you don't steal from people, you share things when you can, you keep your elbows off the table when you're eating. They teach basic comportment to people. You don't, in polite conversation, you don't cough into your hand or something like that. So it's all about teaching basic behavior, basic morality, ways to end poverty, and how to erase class differences. Now, these things are still in play in the modern era, in our modern public schools to this day. We still, in much of, for example, kindergarten is about basic behavior and basic morality, and we add more of the academic functions as we go along. But I'm sure many of you went to public schools and did things like started your day off with the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem. Now, this is, again, not to denigrate those two things, but those two things have nothing to do with how well you're going to do on a math test later on. They're going to have no impact. If you start every morning by getting up and looking into one corner of your bedroom and placing your hand over your heart and saying the Pledge of Allegiance and then singing the national anthem at the top of your lungs, it's not going to make you do better on a history quiz. Okay? So again, it's about non-academic functions and then adding the academic functions in later. So these non-academic functions are critical to the public school structure. And the person behind all of this, the guy who's creating the bulk of this, is a guy named Horace Mann. Horace Mann was a very strict moralist who came out of that Enlightenment era. Now, when I say he was a strict moralist, he was opposed to almost everything. He was opposed to, quote, immorality in art, as he put it, which meant that he went after various Massachusetts museums that had nude sculptures or lewd paintings, as he saw it. He believed that tobacco consumption was immoral, alcohol consumption was immoral. He saw theaters as dens of immorality. He saw ballet as immoral. But within all of this stuff that he's saying, sin, 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 there's one area where he says there's no sin there. Horace Mann believed that children were, quote, perfect beings. And that's a very distinct Enlightenment era philosophy, that children are born perfect. They are born free of sin. But we corrupt them. We as a society corrupt them. So a lot of Enlightenment era thinkers like Horace Mann believed that it was the job of society to prolong that perfection, to make sure that these children can be perfect for as long as possible. That's why when he's talking about how to create these public schools, he's not always talking about academic functions. It's about instilling a lot of those non-academic things into these children. Now, when Mann winds up being placed in charge of public schools, he creates a public school system that would be recognizable to us in the modern era. And again, while I'm saying that this is the basic public school system, understand it's not going to get adopted by everyone right off the bat. It's going to take some time before everybody else is doing things exactly the same way Massachusetts is. It's simply that Massachusetts is sort of an early innovator in all of this. But look at the things that Mann is behind. He favored the creation of a 9-month school year. So getting children into school for the bulk of the year as opposed to staying at home and working for their parents or going to work in a textile mill or going to work in a foundry or something like that, going to work digging ditches for a canal that's being built. Have them in school for 9 months out of the year. Have age-based grading systems. And what I mean by that is that all 5-year-olds are together in kindergarten. All 6-year-olds are grouped together in first grade. All 7-year-olds are grouped together in second grade, and so on and so on. As opposed to one big schoolhouse where a teacher is trying to teach children ranging in age from 4 to 21, as they did in some cases. Horace Mann, while he is a very strict moralizer and he's very religious, he also believed that the public schools should not engage in religious instruction. Now, don't misunderstand that. Horace Mann still believed that every day should start with a common prayer and there should be a Bible reading every day. But what Mann did not think should happen is that the professor, or the teacher, excuse me, in a public school would be the teacher. He did not think that the teacher should then go, all right, children, now that we've heard that reading from the book of 2 Corinthians, let's all sit down and discuss what it actually means. Let me give you a starter point. Mann says that is not these people's jobs. That is the job of the church. And the ministers do a fine job of handling that. So let's keep that situated in the church. We've separated education from the churches. So education will be the purview here. Churches will continue to deal with religious instruction. Mann also believed that the way we chose teachers in these early years, and especially in those so-called one-room schoolhouses that I mentioned earlier, the way we chose teachers in some places was just silly. In some places, it was the oldest person in that village. They would be the quote teacher, regardless of how much experience they had, regardless of what knowledge they had. If you were the oldest person, you were the teacher. Or if you had the highest level of education, you were the teacher. Now, sometimes that's not so bad. If a person had a law degree during this period, they were among the most highly educated people in the world. But let's say that virtually everybody in a community drops out of school at the equivalent of third grade. Well, whoever had achieved third grade, they're going to be the teacher. That doesn't make sense. So what Mann wanted was the establishment of teaching colleges so that we've got a cadre of teachers ready to go out there and instruct these children, and those teachers know what they're doing. They understand that there's a difference between trying to educate a 5-year-old versus a 7th grader versus a 12th grader. Okay? So the establishment of teaching colleges will handle that to make sure that we are maintaining this idea of keeping the corruption out of these kids' lives. Mandatory attendance laws, so kids have to go to school. And then, of course, the big thing Mann wanted was that he wanted the state of Massachusetts to fund them with taxpayer money, and he got it. Massachusetts does do this. So we've got this positive that we're educating everybody regardless of class. We're teaching them all of this good stuff. But then there's also the negative side, which is how a lot of reform actually works. Think about what the negative side to this actually is. What Horace Mann was saying, remember, children are perfect, but they're corrupted by society. We have to maintain that perfection for as long as possible. And how do we do it? We lock them up for 9 months out of the year, 8 hours a day for, quote, their protection. So reform operates, in a lot of cases, reform operates in these two ways: the positive, the good things, and then those elements of sort of social control, if you will. Now, again, since many people saw that the penitentiary had worked, that these public schools were working well, people said institutions work. We should be looking at all problems and saying, what can we create as an institution to solve that problem? So we've got this creation of quote unquote institutionalization, if you will. And here the next key figure is Dorothea Dix. Dorothea Dix, also from Massachusetts, and a devotee of Mann's ideas about the Enlightenment, about morality and all of this stuff. She was actually charged with teaching at the Cambridge jail. She would teach what we today would likely call adult education classes. And when she got to the Cambridge jail, what she found absolutely horrified her. She said that she wound up going into these jails and finding people who had literally gone insane while they were at the jail. And these people, rather than kind of, quote, mixing with the general population, these people were simply confined to the basement in essentially animal-like conditions. And that was sort of the basic sentiment about how insanity was treated during this era. That a person had devolved from human-like status to animal-like status. So you treat them like you're animals. So when they're animals. So Dorothea Dix found people stripped naked of all clothing, found them locked in closets, found them chained to beds, in some cases chained to a loop that had been hammered into the floor. All of these people being treated like absolute animals. So what she argued for, she came out of this and wrote this scathing report about all of this and presented it to the Massachusetts state legislature, arguing for something that will actually help the insane. And what she argued for, again, an institution. Institutions are the problem solver. She's, like many people, this is what she's arguing. The institution in this case is the asylum. And again, she's choosing this word specifically, just like the people who chose penitentiary chose that word specifically. Dorothea Dix is choosing asylum specifically, a safe haven, a place of safety, a place of refuge. That's what an asylum actually is. And underpinning all of this, again, Enlightenment era philosophy. These people are not by nature these horrific beasts. These are people whose environment has done something to them. So if we change the environment, these people can actually be cured. So Massachusetts says, agreed, we're going to create the asylums. We're going to use public money to support these. And the asylums are off and running. But again, it doesn't work out quite the way Dorothea Dix wanted. What we wind up seeing is that population of insane people winds up getting shuffled from essentially one institution to another. And without the proper actual care, these people, just like people in jail, become quote unquote institutionalized. Not only do they live their lives in the institution, where the idea is the institution is the problem solver, but it creates a sort of dependency on the institution as well, that these people simply cannot function outside the confines of that institution. And to, again, bring this forward, in modern times, we've seen an actual backlash against this idea of institutionalization. For example, we have a homeless problem in this country, and about 40 to 50% of the homeless population is the direct result of deinstitutional policies that started in the 1980s. Quite literally, healthcare officials and healthcare officials from the government would go to these asylums and talk to people who were judged to be a harm to themselves or others. They're not part of this. They're staying. But people who were not considered to be harmful to themselves or others were surveyed, and they were surveyed very simply. Do you want to be here or not? That's not literally the questioning, but that was the tone of the questioning. Do you want to be here or not? And most of these people chose not. So they're released. The health care officials order these people's releases from these institutions. Now, not everybody winds up homeless, but a large number of them wind up homeless because without access to medical care, without access to prescriptions, without access to follow-up, many of these people again sort of devolved, if you will. So the backlash has been deinstitutionalization. Now, stage 3 in all of this, we've seen the first phase, which was moral reform, the second stage, which was social reform. Our third stage is radical reform. And these radical reformers see themselves in a very distinct way. The radical reformers are looking at the two biggest problem areas, slavery and the role of women, and saying we need to fundamentally address the problems of slavery and the inequality of women. Now, these two ideas, I'm saying slavery and women, not the problems of slavery or the problems of women. These two ideas are very much linked in the minds of anti-slavery advocates. Slavery in this country had created two very distinct societies here. There was one society that was very much devoted to increased urbanization, people moving from small towns to cities, people moving from agricultural jobs to industrial jobs, people working fewer hours because of that. The life of an industrial worker is not the same clock that an agricultural worker puts in. And with all of that comes a whole spate of different beliefs. That's one side. And then you've got another side that is still dependent on slaves for their labor. They are still overwhelmingly rural and small town, and they depend on slave-grown agriculture for their economic sustenance, if you will. Now, these two distinct societies also had two very distinctly different values. The North, because of this urbanization, because of free labor or wage labor, because of industrialization, they looked at themselves and said, we are devotees to progress and everything that goes along with it. So cities are indicative of progress. Factories are indicative of progress. The creation of schools and institutions, these are all evidence of progress. South, on the other hand, is looking at this and saying, no, all of those things are evidence that we are not living up to the things that the founders wanted us to live up to. The South looked at itself and said, we have remained agrarian. We have remained dependent, if you will, on slave labor. We don't move to cities. We're small town oriented. We take care of people like the enslaved. We have a very solid, clear social structure. So it creates order in society. All of this stuff is what the founding fathers wanted. The founding fathers didn't want cities and public schools and massive industrialization and all of this stuff. The South looks at the North and says, "You guys are going wildly down the wrong road." Now, in 1820, in this same era of reform, we start seeing the first real challenge to slavery in the offing. And it's related to all of this this second great awakening thought. It's related to agricultural change in the United States. It's related to economic change. Prior to this era, when most people thought about, quote, anti-slavery sentiment, they thought of the Quakers. And there's a good reason for this. The Quakers were the only body, the only religious body that had come out against slavery. Every church, every denomination had supported the institution of slavery. Every nation had supported slavery. So there was nobody outside of the Quakers who were saying slavery must be ended. Now, in part, a lot of people didn't think they needed to. A lot of people looked at the world and said slavery is going to die out. It's not suited to the modern world. And they looked at it and said, especially industrial people, they looked at it and said, we don't need to pass laws ending slavery because as we become more industrialized, slavery will become more marginalized. It doesn't have a place in the modern world. So all we've got to do is wait for it to, quote, disappear. But that idea of disappearance itself fades away. And the key thing that changes it, the key thing that causes it, is between 1792 and 1794, Eli Whitney invents and then patents the so-called cotton gin. Now, why this is so important? We talked about this during the War of 1812 lecture. Once the cotton gin is created, it becomes easy to, quote, clean cotton. Cotton production is not just, quote, productive, as in it produces a lot of cotton. It's profitable now, too. And on top of that, when people start going, I got to get into cotton production, they conclude that they need three things. They need land, they need a cotton gin, and they need slaves. So instead of slavery being on the decline, all of a sudden, all new cotton plantations wind up developing with people who are saying, gotta have slaves, gotta have slaves. And for a time, between 1794 and 1808, when the United States actually outlaws the slave trade, there are more ships. There's a spike in ships coming in from Africa bringing slaves to the Western Hemisphere. In 1809, that stops because the United States adopts that law against the slave trade. But every single year, states like South Carolina constantly propose resolutions in the House to reopen the slave trade. So even though South Carolina had reopened it in those interim years, the government closed it, and South Carolina continued to agitate to reopen it. So there's a constant push. There's a constant demand for slaves. The price of slaves actually doubles in some cases from approximately $600 to an average price of $1,200. $1,200, if you're interested in the conversion, $1,200 in say 1810 is roughly the equivalent of about $35,000 today. So slaves were not cheap. This is a lot of money being spent on slave labor. So the idea that slavery is going to simply just disappear, that idea itself goes away. What this means is that people who are anti-slavery are going to have to go with a different tactic if they're going to convince people to end slavery. And what they come up with this scheme called colonization. And colonization is a very odd plan, to say the least. And it's indicative of when people are so desperate to prove that they're addressing a problem, they come up with solutions that really don't actually address the problem. So let's first define what colonization actually is. Colonization is a scheme to voluntarily colonize, as the phrase went, freedmen or freed slaves. I hate the term freed slaves, but for convenience's sake, we're going to use this. To voluntarily colonize freed slaves to a country created in Africa called Liberia. The United States was going to go over. They were going to create this country called Liberia, and they were going to take people who had been voluntarily emancipated by their owners and then transport them back across the Atlantic to Africa. So it's kind of a reversal of the slave trade. Now, when people are doing this stuff, they are putting ideas into their head that convince them that they're doing good here. They believe that slavery is so important a moral issue and so obvious a moral issue that slave owners would rush to do this. And a body called the American Colonization Society forms to actually facilitate this. Their plan is to go throughout the South, talk to slaveholders, say, hey, wouldn't you like to free your slaves and help us create a more moral America? And then the American Colonization Society would pay for the deportation of these people. Now, understand, they're not saying to these emancipated people, you are now free. You are now capable of participating in the American experiment and living your lives as people who have liberty. It's not what they're promoting. The American Colonization Society is promoting this idea that coexistence among peoples from Africa, people of color, and white Americans is simply not possible. If there are free blacks in this country, they will challenge the remainder of slavery, and thus that can't be. So free blacks have to go. There's no law requiring it, but this is the narrative that the American Colonization Society is proposing, this that free blacks really don't have a place in this society. Now, a couple of things wind up working against the American Colonization Society in all of this. First, a slave rebellion happens right outside of Richmond, Virginia. A slave named Gabriel Prosser winds up leading this massive rebellion, a quote unquote army of liberation of slaves that these people are freeing by violence. Their plan, nobody's 100% certain about how it was actually going to play out and what their ultimate goal was. But these enslaved peoples were going to go from plantation to plantation. They were going to kill slave owners. They were going to free the enslaved, and then ultimately march on the capital of Virginia, where they would kidnap the governor of the state, James Monroe, at this point. They're going to kidnap him and then force him to sign an executive order freeing all of the enslaved people in Virginia. So a lot of people in Virginia hear this and go, holy crap. The problem here is that we've been easy. We've been too easy on the enslaved people. We've been letting those colonization nuts talk to us about freeing our slaves. And what these people go is, we have to tighten the screws around slavery. We have to recommit and retrench to slavery. Okay, just like they did with Denmark Vesey's rebellion in places like South Carolina. The same thing is happening here in Virginia. The other thing is that the American Colonization Society demonstrated that this whole process is expensive, obviously, but it's also impractical. For example, on this next slide here, just look at the numbers. You can do the numbers yourself. You don't have to. To try to figure it out here. In 1830, when the 1830 census is taken, the slave population in the United States was roughly 2 million enslaved peoples. In 1829, the United States, or the American Colonization Society, deported 259 people. So all you have to do is divide 2 million by 259 people to realize that using colonization is going to take forever. It's simply not going to work. But in addition to Prosser's rebellion, some other things happened that convinced Americans, especially in places like Virginia, that they've got to regroup around the institution of slavery. One thing we've already talked about, so I'm only going to mention it. David Walker in 1829, as I mentioned, issued his famous Walker's Appeal, as you should read in the Fires of Jubilee. Nat Turner winds up leading a massive slave rebellion in Virginia that winds up killing 60 white people. And what was unique about Nat Turner's rebellion, and this is all I'm going to give you on Turner's rebellion because you're expected to read that book. What turned on with Nat Turner's rebellion was Nat Turner was an avowed Christian. He was also, according to his quote owner, Nat Turner was a, quote, good slave. He had never really given his owner many problems. Now, he had run away and had to have been punished for that. But his, quote, owner said over and over again, I don't understand this. Nat Turner was good. He was well behaved. He didn't give me problems. So people in Virginia start going, well, if a slave like Nat Turner doesn't like slavery, maybe all of the slaves don't like slavery. And my answer to that is obviously, duh, do you think? So this is a problem for Virginians. On top of that, in 1831, Jamaica also experiences a slave rebellion. Jamaica was a possession of the British Empire at this point. Jamaica experiences this slave rebellion that successfully overthrows slavery on the island of Jamaica. It's so successful also that it convinces the British government, which had long outlawed the slave trade, it convinces the British government we also need to outlaw slavery. And what they do in the aftermath of the slave rebellion in Jamaica, the British Parliament announces a plan to end slavery through what's called gradual compensated emancipation. Gradual, it's going to happen gradually over a period of time. Compensated, the slave owners will be paid off emancipation, the freeing of the enslaved. So, over time, the slave owners will be paid to free their slaves. And Britain announces a very aggressive plan. They say, we're going to do this. We're going to end slavery in 2 years across the entirety of the British Empire. Now, while they do succeed for the most part, they're actually not able to completely wipe out slavery until the late 1830s. But all of this makes Southerners look at the world around them and say, hey, why the hell is everybody attacking us? If everybody's attacking us, we better defend our institutions. So this slave rebellion has a huge effect. Now, it might be simple to look at this and go, all of the anti-slavery talk and all of this opposition, the anti-slavery talk is coming out of the North, the opposition is coming out of the South. But understand, it's not just the South that is reacting to these anti-slavery people. Anti-slavery people did predominate in the North. But understand what's at work here. Anti-slavery people were simply the types who would say, slavery's bad, slavery's immoral, I don't think we ought to have slavery. It's something, some of the radicals would say, it's something that's going to contribute to the degradation of your soul. But all of those anti-slavery people were saying, but we shouldn't pass laws that ban it. That's not acceptable. So they're not, quote, abolitionists yet. The way I think you can kind of contextualize this is that they're kind of like the temperance advocates in relation to the prohibitionists. The temperance advocates think alcohol consumption's bad, it's immoral, it's not going to do anything good for you, but I'm not going to pass a law that says you can't do it. I'm just going to explain to you and harangue you about why it's no good. So while anti-slavery advocates predominated in the North, there are a number of people who saw themselves very consciously as anti-slavery, who said these anti-slavery people need to shut their mouths. For example, a group of people who were anti-slavery came into New Haven, Connecticut, got together in New Haven, Connecticut, with the idea of establishing a black college in New Haven, a sort of parallel to Yale University, if you will, but it would be open to free blacks only. However, courtesy of a law that gets passed, and we're going to explain how that law gets passed, the people in New Haven voted down the opening of that college by a margin of 800 to 4. So when the vote was cast, only 4 people voted for the creation of these colleges. Or this college. So how we got to this point, in 1831, Prudence Crandall was operating what was called a comportment school, a school that basically taught young girls how to behave properly, how to behave as young ladies. And I don't mean young ladies like girls do this, girls do. I mean young ladies, how to properly keep house, how to keep the dinner table set, how to make your husband's life easier, how to dress properly, how to rear children properly. All of these sorts of things were part of this comportment school. And a girl named Sarah Harris, her father was a free black farmer, brought her to Crandall's school and said, look, my daughter is very interested in going here, and as long as it doesn't interfere with her chores, I've said that it's okay with me, but obviously we need your permission for her to come to this school. And Crandall thought about it. Crandall was anti-slavery. Crandall thought about it and said, yeah, absolutely, she can come here to this school. And literally the next day, all of the parents of the white children at Prudence Crandall's school pulled their children out of this school. So Sarah Harris went from having essentially a full school to having one student. Not content with this, this mob got together and burned down this school for girls and made it clear, we don't want you operating this school here. If you're going to have black kids, we don't want this. Prudence Crandall was not to be deterred on this front. And the buildings continuously get attacked. They're constantly set on fire. But she doubles down on this in a very meaningful way. Crandall says, okay, I'm going to borrow money from all of these abolitionists. A guy named William Lloyd Garrison is a person we're going to talk about in a few minutes. He's one of them. She says, I'm going to build a new school, and instead of it replacing the comportment school, it's going to be totally different. It's going to be open only to black children. So, again, mobs attack this stuff, and it gets so bad that ultimately in 1833, Connecticut passes a law that makes it illegal to educate blacks from outside of the state without local permission. Now, the assumption obviously is that most black people living in Connecticut are free only because they have run away from slavery in the South. And there's some truth to that, that once people got to the North, the thought was once they got to the North, they're free. So a lot of these people were actually runaways. So these people in Connecticut are not as sort of open as you might think, even though they're all proclaiming anti-slavery. They're saying we're not going to go the next step in all of this stuff. Now, it's at this moment that William Lloyd Garrison steps onto the scene. And William Lloyd Garrison is totally different than any of the other advocates we've talked about. William Lloyd Garrison comes to the forefront precisely because he is not in favor of, quote, anti-slavery. He instead is in favor of abolitionism. And why he's calling this abolition is he's saying flat out, we're not going to do this gradually over time. We're not going to pay these people for engaging in this horrifying institution. In the very first issue of a newspaper he creates called The Liberator in 1831, Garrison calls for, quote, the immediate emancipation without compensation of all enslaved people across the country. And he also calls on the North. He says, the North, we've obviously gone down this road where we've largely eliminated slavery. So what we're going to call for here is the granting of immediate equal rights for free African Americans in the North. Now, this angered a lot of people. This really upset tons of people. And surprisingly enough, it angered a lot of Northern anti-slavery people, in addition to the obvious. I mean, I've got on the screen here that Georgia and Louisiana both put a bounty on Garrison's head for $25,000, but Northerners didn't like Garrison either. And the reason for this was very simple. They believed that he was taking the argument too far, that he was radicalizing them. People who were anti-slavery advocates could claim that they weren't for something necessarily radical. They could point, as we did earlier in this class, they could point to the words of Thomas Jefferson and say, look, even Thomas Jefferson, while he owned slaves, said that slavery's bad and has to end at some point. So anti-slavery is not a big step from that. But stepping up and saying, it ends today, and we do it immediately without compensation, that is radical. It's not conservative thought. Okay. Also, Garrison called colonization a, quote, fraud and a hoax. Why people were so angry about this? He's out there he's out there talking about this stuff in these incredibly fiery terms, and I'm saying he's screaming and yelling. He's not really literally screaming and yelling. But what he's advocating for is upsetting the social order. It is on some level revolutionary. It is radical in every way, because those anti-slavery advocates could point to several things. They could say, yes, we don't like slavery, but we cannot deny that slavery is what integrates the Northern economy. All of those textile mills across the Middle Atlantic, as I told you, are dependent on Southern-grown cotton. The investments in part of it are from Southern-grown cotton and the profits. The people who own the vessels that travel across the globe trading all of this stuff, they fill those cargo holds up with Southern-grown agricultural products like cotton and indigo and rice, tobacco. If they get down to places like Louisiana, they're pulling sugarcane out of those regions. So they depend on slave labor and slave-grown agriculture to fill all of that stuff up. And if you upset all of this, then they know the economy is going to take a tumble. Also, slavery is the United States' system of, quote, racial control, if you will. And what I mean by that is a lot of Northerners, again, intellectually are anti-slavery, but they also know that the overwhelming numbers of African Americans, people who are American but of African descent, are in the South. So they maintain, as long as we have slavery, we don't have to worry about a flood of people of African descent to the north. That means we don't have them competing for jobs. We also don't have to worry about people of African descent wanting to marry our daughters. There's plainly stated, there is a fear of racial amalgamation or miscegenation in the minds of a lot of Northerners. They are convinced that all of these people are going to come up to the north. They're going to intermarry and intermingle, and they're going to, quote, degrade white people as a consequence of this. They don't want it. Also, another problem here is that abolition appealed directly to women. William Lloyd Garrison told women in writing in the pages of the Liberator, you should come out and join us. You have as much to gain by joining with us as the enslaved have to gain by our actions. And a lot of men looked at this and said, hey, look, it's one thing to be against slavery, but what you're talking about sounds dangerously like women's liberation. And by God, I will not stand for that. I am in favor of freeing slaves, but these girls in my family are under my control as the father figure of this household. They are mine to control. So it challenged patriarchy. It challenged male authority in a very meaningful way. And how Garrison is able to convince people of this is actually very simple. Garrison is able to argue that slavery is at the centerpiece of the United States system and the heart of our society. How can this be? How can it be at the heart of our society? Well, Garrison points out that slavery is a system that, at the end of the day, relies on force. And force is the driving thing. It's the underlying fact, if you will, of slavery. It's the underlying fact of how we deal with Native Americans, with the indigenous people. It's the underlying truth of how we deal with families in this country at this particular moment. Garrison argues that the family is not much more than a, quote, little plantation, with the father of the family, the patriarch of the family, taking the same power over everybody in his household that slave owners take over the enslaved in their societies. So he says our very family structure is corrupt and reliant on power. And then he looks at the Constitution and he says, yep, everything in this document is corrupt. He calls it a corrupt bargain that has been struck with the devil. It is a bargain with, it's a covenant with the devil and a bargain with hell, he says. So he says, since that's the case, not only should we be working to end slavery, not only should we be working toward women's liberation, we should also seek to overturn everything in society. He tells his supporters, no point in voting because the system is rigged, obviously. No point in serving on juries because all juries do is they serve the ends of this Constitution, which is an evil document. It serves the ends of capitalism, he says, and capitalism is inherently corrupt. So Garrison is on everything. He's saying we don't vote, we don't serve on juries. He even goes as far as burning a copy of the Constitution on the steps of the same hall in Philadelphia where the Constitutional Convention met. So he's radicalized a lot of people, and he's turned them into incredibly radical forces. There are other people who are looking at Garrison and saying there's probably a middle ground between Garrison's radicalism and doing nothing. And those people were led primarily by Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is a moderate in a lot of ways. He is radical. I don't want to give you the wrong impression. Frederick Douglass is a very radical person in a lot of ways. He had escaped from slavery from Maryland in the 1820s. He referred to himself frequently as a thief. He said, "I am a thief. I've stolen these bones and this body." And he's clearly an abolitionist. He clearly believes in what Garrison is talking about. But in terms of changing society, Douglas, in a lot of ways, is a moderate. He believes that the path toward changing society is through a political turn, not by simply saying, society's so corrupt, we shouldn't even involve ourselves in it. Douglas is saying, no, get out and vote. Vote for candidates who would be anti-slavery. Vote for candidates who support the same sorts of things that we do, and will be able to slowly overthrow all of this stuff. Now, in time for the 1840 election, Douglas helps establish a political party called the Liberty Party, and this Liberty Party it's only around for 2 elections. It's and its turnout, its vote total, very unimpressive on some level. 1840, for example, they get 7,000 votes in the presidential election. That's 7,000 votes nationally. So that's nothing. Even in that era, it's practically nothing. In 1844, they run another campaign for president, and this time they get 40,000 votes, which again still is not very much. But why it's important and why I'm bringing it up is those 40,000 votes were centered mostly in Michigan and in New York. And in Michigan and in New York, by doing this, it split the vote of these reformist movements in the United States. It split the Liberty Party and the so-called Whig Party votes. And this allowed, in 1844, this split in Michigan and New York allowed for the election of a Democrat named James K. Polk, a pro-slavery, pro-expansionist president who is ultimately going to provoke a war with Mexico on his own way out the door. In 1848, the Liberty Party changes its name to the Free Soil Party, meaning that they oppose the expansion of slavery into our territories. And then by 1854, the Free Soil Party has evolved again and started calling itself the Republican Party. And this is the Republican Party that still exists to this day. Their roots were in challenging the status quo in the United States. Now, Garrison, remember, is very much pro-feminism in this era, and he provokes a split over the issue of feminism and the role of women. Garrison flat out says at a group called the American Anti-Slavery Society, which was a sort of umbrella group, he says that not only must we be committed to ending slavery immediately, we also need to commit ourselves to women's liberation. We need to commit ourselves to feminism. So, since they're trying to end discrimination against women, a lot of the radicals within the anti-slavery society and within the movement generally, they stick around. But conservatives go, again, this is too much. We're not in favor of this. So they walk out. They walk out of all of this. Garrison decides the time has come to put women at the forefront of the movement. When I say put them at the forefront, I mean literally at the forefront. Have women speaking out against slavery at American Anti-Slavery Society and at abolitionist meetings. And this also causes a problem. The reason for this is very simple. A lot of anti-slavery society meetings were held in churches at local levels. They were held in churches. And a lot of these churches read the letters of St. Paul from Corinthians and Ephesians and all of this stuff in the New Testament. And they concluded that having women, quote, instruct men was contrary to the laws of God. They said, if you're going to put women like Angelina and Sarah Grimke up front to tell us about the immorality of slavery, well, we can't let you do that. That's immoral according to the teachings of St. Paul. Now, that's strange. And Garrison says, I don't care. I want women doing this. I want Angelina and Sarah Grimke speaking out. And the reason is very simple. And it's the same reason that Garrison chose guys like Frederick Douglass to speak out. It's a reason why he reached out to Sojourner Truth and had her speak. It's a reason why he got all of these different groups of people to speak to these anti-slavery societies. They could speak to slavery in ways that Garrison himself could not. Garrison was upper middle class from Massachusetts, never owned slaves, never got his hands dirty, never seen slavery in action. He knew philosophically it was wrong, but that's as far as he could take it. He could say, look, I've got the ideas, but I can't demonstrate, short of a philosophical argument, that slavery is wrong. So Douglass is very important because Douglass was enslaved himself. Douglass could say, yes, slavery is harmful. Here's how it's harmful. Here's what I lived through. Women like Sojourner Truth could speak to slavery in a way that even Douglass couldn't. Sojourner Truth could say, I too was enslaved, but I was enslaved as a woman, which means that my slavery experience was totally different than Frederick Douglass's. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it means that you have not been reading The Price for Their Pound of Flesh. So her experience is something that Douglass could never speak to. Bringing the Grimke sisters into this puts another layer to this. The Grimkes were actually from a slave-holding family in South Carolina. And they could talk again about slavery from a totally different perspective. They rejected their family's ideas. They rejected their devotion to slavery. And they began denouncing slavery to these mixed assemblies of men. And they themselves were told, you speak here again, you're going to be in real trouble. So Sarah Grimke wound up writing a book about the principles of feminism, but she wrote it first. The first part of it denounces all of these preachers who were talking about how women should not be allowed to speak out and all of this sort of stuff. But it also kind of shifts throughout the narrative. It starts shifting into an argument about how women are treated unequally in virtually all aspects of American society. She calls for equal pay. She calls for equal access to jobs on the same footing as men. And she consciously compares her conditions of life and the conditions of women to those of the enslaved. She talks about there being a parallel. Now, I've said this on two separate occasions now, that there's a, quote, parallel between the lives of women and the lives of enslaved people. Understand that these people are not dumb. They know that enslaved people live something that's awful, that even they, as white women, and as oppressed as they are, will never actually live through. So they're not idiots. They get it. But what they're trying to do, again, is make a philosophical argument which requires the creation of this parallel narrative. Now, given what William Lloyd Garrison is doing in an attempt to push feminism and push women to the forefront, his next steps are not a surprise. There's going in 1840, there's going to be a London anti-slavery convention. And as president of the American Anti-Slavery Society, William Lloyd Garrison gets to name the American delegation to that meeting. And Garrison has more than a dozen people he's going to name, and he names some men, but for the most part, the majority of the delegates are women. He says flat out, the conditions are connected, so we're going to have women represent us at this convention. And when these women get to this London convention, they are horrified by their treatment. They are first refused entry to the convention. Now remember, this is a convention on human rights and on freedom. And they are told that for us to allow you to sit in this body, even if you sit quietly and say nothing, for us to do that is, quote, contrary to the laws of God. So women like Elizabeth Cady Stanton got themselves very angry in this case, and I'm not suggesting that they're wrong to be angry. And they kind of browbeat the leaders of this assembly and said, you know, we're not going anywhere. You better figure out a way to incorporate us here. And ultimately, they are allowed to come to the meetings, but they're also told that they must sit in a balcony where they will be, where they cannot be seen by the delegates to the convention on the actual floor. So Stanton was horrified. She was offended. She was also pretty embarrassed by this whole thing. So she comes home and starts working on a way to put women at the forefront of a feminist movement, to say, look, we're not part of the abolitionist movement anymore. We're something totally separate. So she does this, and in 1848, she's ready to call this convention. And this convention is the so called Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. I say so called because it meets in Seneca Falls, New York, so it's called the Seneca Falls Convention. Now, what they do, they don't literally take the American Declaration of Independence and strike out man and right women, but what they're doing at the Seneca Falls Convention is they are issuing a Declaration of Independence for women. And they are saying that women must be treated equally. Women are due the same natural rights as men, and it's high time that everybody started accepting this. But they committed themselves to a singular policy goal. With all of this stuff saying we believe in freedom, we believe in equality, we believe that we're just as good as men, that we should be treated equally in all facets of life, they have one policy goal, and that is getting women the right to vote, period. Now, this women's movement, again, is happening right in the middle of all of this reform spirit across the country. And it's happening, it's happening at this moment should not be surprising. And if we look at what the role of women is at 1800, at the turn of the century, it's actually women are in pretty bad shape. Women do not have the chance to vote anywhere. New Jersey had already rescinded what they considered a quote mistake in the wording of their laws. So women even women who own property were not allowed to vote in New Jersey. Because they couldn't vote, they also were prohibited from holding office. Women were also excluded from virtually all professions. And what I mean by that is they're excluded from being teachers. They can't be professors. They can't be doctors. They can't be lawyers. None of that stuff is actually available to them as an occupation. The licensing requirements, the boards or the bodies that actually license you are saying to them, no, you can't take this exam. And women also have a problem in terms of their actual legal status in society. Women's lives are governed by something called coverture. Women did not have a legal identity. They were considered in many ways legally to belong to their male guardian, as it was called. If a woman was unmarried, her guardian, no matter how old she was, her guardian was her father. And if her father was not alive, then her guardianship passed to her oldest uncle. If all of her uncles were deceased, it passed to her oldest brother. If a woman got married, her guardianship transferred to her husband. If her husband died, it reverted to her father, and then down the lines to uncles, brothers, and all of that sort of stuff. So women don't have a legal identity, which means they can't make contracts during this period. They can't sue or be sued. They simply don't have a legal identity here. So women are going to move to change this. And we see after 1800, because of this, the reason women are going to move toward this feminist idea is because their conditions are starting to worsen. But as we talked about with the revolution of rising expectations, we're seeing things start to improve too. For example, most women their status is dictated as domestic, and that is a specific downgrade. It's almost, quote, degrading. What I mean by that is that nobody denied that women worked, okay? But women worked in the home doing things that were considered part of the domestic sphere. They cooked, they cleaned, they took care of children, they took care of maybe some farm chores. But what's important about the work that they did was that they were not paid wages for it the same way the men that they were married to did get paid wages. Those men frequently worked outside of the home for wages. So we have a society beginning in the late 1790s and carrying us through these early 1800s. A society that increasingly values a person based on the wages that they are earning. So if a woman makes no wages, she has no social value. Also, as we're going to be dealing with in the next lecture primarily, Americans are becoming more democratic, meaning the idea that people should vote is starting to be expanded. The number of people who are permitted to vote are being expanded or is being expanded, except women. Women are not part of that equation. So literally half of the population is not involved here. So women's position in society is declining, but we also see areas of improvement. For example, women's literacy rates were far higher than men, and their attendance at what we would call today high school and college was also higher. Now, not because people said these women need this education to do the jobs of the modern era. The thought was in a small r Republican society, women are the first teachers that their children have. So it is beneficial to all of us as a society for women to know what the duties of Republican citizenship actually is, what it means to be a citizen, what it means to be patriotic, to teach their kids a little bit about the history of this country, and to teach them the basics so that when they get to school, they're not complete blank slates. So women actually are going to college and getting a fair amount of education during this period. We're seeing they're taking control of their bodies in ways that are pretty obvious here. The birth rate is starting to decline in the United States, and we're also seeing births clustered earlier in people's marriages. And there's not any sort of revolution in birth control or anything like that. So this is literally women taking control of their bodies during this era. Now, we also see women starting to move into some occupations slowly, but they are moving into occupations like journalism is considered to be acceptable for women to engage in because, after all, they're just simply telling what happened. Obviously, women are going to be allowed to be mill workers and older unmarried women. There's a place for them too. If you have a whole bunch of mill workers who are living at the mill, essentially, then these women are going to essentially become dorm mothers. Horace Mann believes that putting women at the front of school classrooms is going to be an important thing toward learning because he believes that women are better suited to teaching than men are, that they're better suited as nurturers, so they'll make good teachers. So he pushes to have women put at the front of classrooms. Women are also doing things that are obviously radical here, too. They're starting to publish their own newspapers. They're not just engaging in journalism and working for men, they're publishing their own newspapers. For example, Amelia Bloomer publishes a newspaper called The Una or The One. Elizabeth Cady Stanton publishes a newspaper that lays it bare what this whole thing is, calls it The Revolution. And women are starting again to feminism is becoming more and more important, and women are starting to see their status increase. Now, a lot of women thought the fight, quote unquote, was over in 1866 when Congress passes the 14th Amendment to the United States. Congress, or the 14th Amendment, stated it determines who is a citizen and who is not in this country. And clearly, women were citizens. That wasn't even in dispute at this point. But it stated also that the rights of citizenship apply equally to all citizens. So many women believed this meant I can vote now. And several women tried to register to vote, particularly in New Jersey. When they tried to register to vote, they were turned down, so they filed lawsuits. And these lawsuits made their way through the court system. And ultimately, the Supreme Court ruled this is kind of a crazy ruling, but the Supreme Court ruled that the custom that women do not vote, overrules the 14th Amendment. They said the legal argument you women are making is sound. The amendment absolutely says this. However, we've already established in this country as a custom that women don't vote. So therefore, you don't get the right to vote. Now, because of these types of losses, it's easy for people to look at feminism, or first wave feminism, as this is frequently called. It's easy to look at that and say, well, it was a failure. After all, they did not get the right to vote until 1920. So it's a failure. But that is sort of a short-sighted way to look at this. The lives of women, courtesy of feminism, did begin to improve throughout this era. Most states, I shouldn't say most states, virtually every state passed laws that protected the property rights of married women. So instead of a woman gets married and her property automatically reverts to her husband, states said over and over and over again that, look, there are good reasons to protect the sanctity of this woman's property, so her property is protected. Property is the basis of society. It's the basis of liberty, they said, so we should protect their rights here. Divorce laws also were reformed during this period. A lot of women were having to get stuck in these marriages that they simply could not escape, even when people looked at it and said, yeah, we don't like to do this, but this marriage is a disaster. They couldn't get out of it because in the colonial era and in the early national period, divorces were granted by an act of the state legislature. So if the state legislature was not meeting for another year, or if the state legislature met and said, look, we don't have time to put this on our agenda, these women are out of luck. So ultimately, advocates for feminism began arguing that sometimes for the literal protection of women, for their physical protection, for the protection of their lives, for the protection of their children, for the protection of property, divorces are sometimes absolutely necessary. So what, again, state after state after state did was they transferred the powers to grant divorces from the state legislatures to judges who were able to grant divorces, quote, as they deem reasonable. Now, this doesn't lead to a flood of divorces because most judges said, look, you got to have a very good reason to divorce. The idea in 1840 of divorcing for quote unquote irreconcilable differences was impossible. But the point here is that you don't have to wait for the legislature to meet. You've only got to wait for a calendar date on the judge's calendar. So these sorts of things are actually liberalized, and women do start to see increased rights. So when you take 1302, understand that much of 1302 is taken up with realizing the rights that women actually have. So that's where we stop for this particular lecture. Join me in lecture 13, American Democracy, next time.